Hello, everyone. My name is Mary Collier. I'm the Professional Development Program Manager at the Ontario Museum Association, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the third webinar in the Indigenous Collection Symposium series. I want by acknowledging that Toronto, where the OMA offices are and where we're broadcasting from today, has been the site of human activity for more than 15,000 years. Land is a traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and has been home to the Haudenosaunee, including the Seneca and the Huron-Wendat as well. So today, Toronto is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. Before we get started with the presentations, I just want to make sure that everybody knows how to participate today. So you'll see the slides, and you'll be able to hear the presenters speak. A question or make a comment to the presenters, simply type your message into the chat box, which will open at the right side of your screen, and click send. We'll be chat, and we'll do our best to ensure that all your questions are answered during today's webinar. If you're having any technical issues, Josh Lichty here at the OMA is signed in as an attendee, and can send him a message through the chat for assistance. I'd also like to recognize the project partners for the Indigenous Collection Symposium. Indigenous Knowledge Center at the Six Nations Polytechnic, the Woodland Center, and the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto. Of course, also like to acknowledge our funders, the Government of Canada and the Government of Ontario, for supporting this project. The theme of the Indigenous Collection Symposium is Promising Practices, Challenging Issues, and Changing the System. And so while the speaker of the symposium itself will be talking about those issues and practices and changes that need to be made going forward, the purpose of these webinars is to provide some context for those conversations to happen. Today's presentation will include an overview of the Indigenous peoples who live in Ontario and their history. It'll explain what treaties are and explain how treaties were part of the colonial process in what is now Ontario. To provide an orientation to the symposium's location, we'll share an introduction to the history of who the nations of the Grand River are, as well as their neighbors, the Mississaugas of New Credit. So two presenters with us today. Alison Norman is a historian and research advisor who works with the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. Her academic work focuses on Six Nations, gender, and the history of Indigenous education in Ontario. And Dan Laxer is also a historian who works with the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. His academic work focuses on the history of the North American fur trade. So Daniel will do their presentation, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So I'm going to start off by passing the mic to Alison.
Good afternoon. So I'll get us started very briefly, and then I'll turn it over to Daniel. Thanks so much for having us and inviting us to be part of your, I guess, sort of your preparations for your symposium. And I'm sort of jealous that I'm not a museums professional because it looks fantastic, your event later this week. So we weren't sure how much you all know. We assume that many of you have some knowledge. Many of you may be very knowledgeable, but we assume that you're in this because you would like to learn some more. So we also got some suggested readings and websites at the end of the presentation. Of course, we're also very happy for you to send us an email afterwards if you have any other questions or would like more information about something. So we're sort of giving a broad overview of several topics. And we are talk also a little bit about the work that Dale and I do in terms of limbs, and in part because that's very much connected to the treaty history that we'll talk a bit about. Just to introduce myself a little bit more, I have my background is as an academic, as a historian for several years. I taught Great Lakes Indigenous history at the University of Toronto and at Ryerson and at Trent. My research focused quite a bit on women and on education. I did a postdoctoral fellowship at Trent, and I did some research for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on residential schools. And then all years ago, I started working in the ministry, doing on all sorts sorts of things, but certainly a good part of my work relates to land claims. So for some of the presentation, I'll be sort of wearing my ministry hat and speaking to you about sort of land claims and research in that context. And then other part, I'll be talking about the history of the Six Nations and the Mississaugas of the New Credit, sort of communities where you're that you'll be very close to for your event later this week. And I'm talking sort of more as a historian from my own knowledge as a researcher. So I'm going to pass it over to Daniel and let him introduce himself a bit more if he likes and get started.
Hey, hello everyone. My name is Daniel Laxer and welcome to this webinar. I'm going to say a few things about myself before I jump into our presentation today. So I'm actually from Edmonton, Alberta originally and did my undergrad at U of A. Then I did my master's degree at York University and went on to do my PhD at the University of Toronto on the fur trade and especially interactions between Europeans and Indigenous peoples in fur trade. I graduated in 2015 with my PhD, and last year I was doing some work for the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, and I've been working at the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation since January. So I'm going to just jump right into it, I think, because we have quite a few slides to get through and quite a lot of great content to give you. So I just want to, before we start, just repeat what I said. This is, kind of an overview of the topic. Certainly, we are just scratching the surface here today, but it would be important to this kind of just general overview of, who Indigenous peoples are in Ontario and some of the history behind it. To flip the slides, and hopefully that will move across everyone's screen. So I've just scrolled over 3 slides to our intro slide, and now I'm going to move over to, well, there's an overview that Alison already presented. So here's where I start. So here's Indigenous peoples in Ontario. So first I'm going to start by looking at just a bit of terminology. This is the very basic terminology. Who Indigenous people refer to. So this is the collective term we use for the 3 groups of Indigenous peoples of North America and their descendants. The Canadian Constitution recognizes 3 groups of Aboriginal people, and these are really 3 distinct peoples with unique histories, languages, and cultural practices and spiritual beliefs. And our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Now, the kind of chosen term has moved from Aboriginal to Indigenous, and in fact, the ministry that I now work for used to be called the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs. About months ago, it changed to the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation because the terminology itself as Indigenous has become the kind of most accepted term. So the next slide now. This is kind of the 2 main Indigenous language families in Ontario. And the map that you see there is actually a 16th century map showing the groups there at the time. So there are Algonquian speakers, and these include the Anabe, the Montagnais, as well as the Ojibwe, the Chippewa, which is sometimes just a different name used historically to refer to the Ojibwe. It's the name they use, for instance, in the United States. But the Ottawa, the Algonquin, and the Saulteaux. So these are some of the Algonquian speakers in Ontario. But there's a whole other language family, and these are the Iroquoian speakers. And so category, you have of course, the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, or the Nations Confederacy, sometimes called. And these include the Mohawk, Ida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Sitka, and then in the 18th century, the Tuscarora joined the Six Nations and make them actually 6. There were other Iroquoian speakers in what is now southern Ontario, 17th century, specifically the Huron-Wendat peoples who lived around Toronto and up into, just south of Georgian Bay. Their civilization was an Iroquoian-speaking one, and there were groups too, such as the Neutral and the Erie. So I'm not going into too much detail about these groups, besides just wanting to introduce to you now these different language families and how within each of these families there are also distinct languages. Moving on, the next slide is just an introductory slide about the Métis in Ontario. So the Métis are people of mixed Indigenous and European heritage who are descendants of communities that have historic links to the fur trade and early Canadian history. And the culture is rich and distinct in terms of music and governance programs and culture, and actually speak Michif, a distinct language based on the Indigenous dialects, as well as French. And Métis, really known historically in the fur trade era as interpreters, middlemen, guides, voyageurs, and trappers. And they lived close to First Nations communities and usually had close ties to those communities. And I want to point out before actually the Métis Nation of Ontario is quite significant. It maintains a membership registry of over 15,000 members and has 29 local organizations or community councils. So quite an important group in Ontario. Slide. The in Ontario. Inuit homelands in Canada are found, as many of you know, in the far north, including Nunavut and the territories, the Yukon, northern Quebec, and Labrador. Inuit regions cover actually 1/3 of Canada's landmass. Inuit means the people, and the Inuit language is called Inuktitut, and the term by which Inuit refer to themselves. So the old term Eskimo was what was applied by European explorers and is no longer really used in Canada, although there are some communities and some community members who are not actually really up to this term. So there's more information on this slide, but I'm actually skip over it, and you can read it if you'd like, but I'm going to move on now to the next slide. So, who are the First Nations in Ontario today? Today, there are 133 recognized First Nations in Ontario, over 250,000 Indigenous people living in Ontario. Half of these are living on reserve, and half are living off reserve, especially in the bigger cities in Ontario: Thunder Bay, Sudbury, Sault Ste. Marie, Ottawa, and Toronto. So the Six Nations of Grand River Reserve near Brantford is the largest, with over 20,000 members. And the four Ontario First Nations is a small remote community, accessible only by air year-round, or sometimes by ice road in the winter. And Ontario actually has more remote nations than any other region in Canada. And before I move on, I just give you a couple of demographic figures because I think they are significant. Ontario actually has the largest Indigenous population in Canada. 21% of Canada's total Indigenous population lives within Ontario, and make up about 2% of Ontario's total population. And yeah, again, it's important to just stress that this is a significant population. So in Toronto, for instance, Toronto has the largest urban Indigenous population in Canada, which is estimated at 60,000 to 70,000 people. Okay, I'm going to move on to give you a very brief, and as a historian, I'm always a bit uncomfortable giving such kind of brief, generalized, simplistic accounts history, which is, of course, very complicated and nuanced. But I do think it's important to just give a brief history of colonial policy at this point. So, trees and reserves, really the larger colonial project of the British Crown and later the Canadian government. And colonial policy had a number of objectives, and some of these are listed here. Having Indigenous peoples live on reserves, to separate them from the settlers was one kind of goal of colonial policy. Missionary work and conversion to Christianity was another kind of major goal of British colonial policy. Promoting nuclear families over larger extended families was another objective. Promoting agriculture instead of traditional ways of supporting families. And along with this is kind of promoting a sedentary lifestyle, one where people are not moving around as much, but are very centered on a particular plot of land and are making their living from agricultural products on it. And finally, schools. And the first schools were built by missionaries with the support of the government, and both day schools and then residential schools play a big role in Ontario's policy with Indigenous peoples going forward. So some of the basic kind of goals and objectives of colonial policy over the last 200 years. But the whole point there in bold is important, that the signing of treaties and the move to reserves was part of this larger colonial project at the time. This is important just to get a sense of colonial past, and then we can talk about some ways that changes have been made in the last few decades. So I'm going to move on to the next slide now. Slide before handing it off to Alison again. So residential schools, this is something that we have been hearing a lot about since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. A really important part of not Canadian history, but specifically Ontario's history that we should be aware of. So residential schools were established in many communities, and children, Indigenous children, were forced to attend these schools starting after Confederation in 1867. So thirds of Indigenous children attended local day schools, while 1/3 approximately attended residential schools. And these were often quite far away from their home community. 18 schools across Ontario, generally run by the church and funded by the federal government. Last residential school in Ontario closed in 1974, and this was at Fort Frances. And in Ontario, main schools were the Mohawk Institute, now at the site of the Woodland Cultural Center, and Mount Elgin School, which closed in 1954. It closed officially in the 1860s. That's right. Well, I have actually 2 dates for when it was open, so apologies on that. It went until the 1950s. It was established in the 1850s, but it was closed during the 1860s, during a brief window. It was one of the long-lived schools in Southern Ontario, just like the Mohawk Institute. Okay, so that's kind of the brief overview of Indigenous peoples that we give, and I'm going to turn it over now to Alison, and she's going to give specific histories of Six Nations and Mississaugas of the New Credit.
No, I'm sorry, that was my it's on that slide, so hopefully it didn't confuse you too much about that residential school history. So the section I'm going to talk a little bit about the Six Nations of Grand River and then the Mississaugas of the New Credit. And those, I know that your conference is taking place at Six Nations, and New Credit is the corner of the Six Nations Reserve, and they're also the host nation for Toronto and the inhabitants of much of southwestern Ontario. I'm going to give you a bit of background on both of those communities and sort of some of the general history of those two First Nations. And this is a very, very brief history of who these people are. I am very sure that you're going to learn a lot more about who these people are. Best source, which is to learn from the people of Six Nations themselves, from the Woodland Cultural Center, and from all the speakers that I saw in your program later this week. So this is just a bit of a background, and I'm an outsider to this community. I'm obviously not from this community. So the Six Nations of Grand River, it's an interesting story. This is sort of the only First Nation in Canada that isn't originally from Canada. If you remember the earlier map that Daniel showed you with those language families, so that an anthropologist, Bruce Trigger, created, I think, 1980s of who are the language families and where they located in the 16th century when Europeans arrived. Six Nations, at the time there were 5 nations, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, in upstate New York, across from east to west on the south side of Lake Ontario. And that was their traditional territory, which scholars have called Iroquois. And that community had a long contact with European settlers and explorers. And sort of the more recent history, they were allied with the British. Many of I'd say they were entirely allied with the British. When the American Revolution occurred, some nations people allied with the British, and others sort of tried to stay neutral and then ended up allying with the Americans or the Patriots, depending on whose side you're on. Obviously, I think most of us know how that war turned out. The British ended up rewarding the Loyalists. I'm sure many of you know the Loyalist history, and the Loyalists came to Ontario. Well, Six Nations Loyalists also came to Ontario. So the British signed several land surrenders with the Mississaugas, and I'll talk about that next. And then the British were in possession of much of southwestern Ontario. And they granted this piece of land called the Haldimand Tract, which you see there on the map, to the Six Nations, and that was, a reward for their service and loyalty during the American Revolution. So, obviously, the river wiggles, but the Haldimand Proclamation and the tract is set 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, source to the mouth. And as many of you know, that's the lovely farmland. Joseph Brant, who was the leader of most of the people who came to this part of the world after the Revolution, had come and looked at the land, and while the British actually offered some land at eastern Ontario near the Bay of Quinte, most of the Six Nations chose to come and live in the Grand River, and a smaller group went and did live and became Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. So initially lived in national villages along the Grand River, so there was a Cayuga village and a Mohawk village spread out along the river. And over time, and again, this is a big, complicated history, and I don't want to do it a disservice by summarizing too quickly, but much of the land was sold off, was lost to squatters, was stolen. It's a complicated history, and numerous land claims in litigation. But that piece of land became a much smaller piece over time. 7, the leadership at Six Nations sold off the land that they had left, consolidated into what we now know as the Six Nations of Grand River Reserve. So this is a more modern map. And at the same time, interestingly, they offered land to the Mississaugas of the New Credit. The Mississaugas, I'll talk about them next. They lost most of their traditional territory in southwestern Ontario. And so at the time that the Six Nations were selling off some of their land and consolidating, they offered this corner piece of their reserve, what was to become their reserve, to the Mississaugas of the New Credit. So on that map, you can see the bottom right-hand corner, most of the reserve is sort of green, but that bottom piece is purplish gray. And that was given to the Mississaugas of the New Credit. And there's a much bigger, longer history to that as well. Okay. The Six Nations, I'm going to, very briefly sort of give an overview of the culture of the community. And again, I'm only going to give you a few little bits, and you'll learn a lot more later this week. People who came in 1784 from New York and who settled, many of them were Christian, and quite a few of them were still the traditional faith, the Longhouse faith. Churches were established, and this Her Majesty's Royal Chapel of the Mohawks, the oldest surviving church building in the province, the first Anglican church in Upper Canada, and quite a few of the leaders, including Joseph Brant, were Anglican. Joseph Brant actually is buried in Burlington, but his tomb was moved, and it's on the right side of the Mohawk Chapel there. He is also interred there, and there's a monument to Pauline Johnson. So if you have a chance to visit this Mohawk Chapel, it's right down the road from the Woodland Cultural Center, where I think you'll be. You drive right by it, so you should definitely go have a look. And if you go out the back, you can see the Grand River out back. So community, it's large and complicated. People were Anglican and Baptist, as well as the traditional faith. Established schools, day schools on the reserve, 12 schools by the end of the 19th century, as well as the Mohawk Institute, which was the original name of the residential school. Was in the original Haldeman Tract, but then when they consolidated the reserve, it then afterwards became sort of outside of the reserve boundaries. Some children from Six Nations definitely went to that school, I think more so in the 20th century than the 19th century, because many local children went to local day schools, and the Mohawk Institute also seemed to get children from other parts of Ontario, including Eastern Ontario. Community, also an important point is that it was an agricultural community. It had been a horticultural society traditionally. The Haudenosaunee were horticulturalists. I'm sure some of you have heard of the Three Sisters, the corn, beans, and squash that were cultivated by Haudenosaunee people traditionally. And so many of the leaders were interested in learning sort of Western methods of farming, and the Six Nations were seen as very successful agriculturalists in the 19th and early 20th century. It made a very successful reserve in the eyes of the Department of Indian Affairs and the government. There's all sorts of people from nations historically and in the present who are well-known Haudenosaunee people or Canadians. I'm going to move on to the next group, and I think it's important to talk about the Mississaugas and the Mississaugas of the New Credit in particular. If you're in Toronto or in much of Southern Ontario, for many of us, this is the nation on whose land we live and work. It is for me. And it's interesting because the land that the Six Nations are on also was previously Mississauga land. The Mississaugas have a particular connection to water. The word Mississauga comes from a word meaning many river mouths. And the Mississauga were often had village sites on the mouths of rivers, including the Trent, the Shannon, the Napanee, and Gananoque River. You'll see the symbol on the right there, the community's symbol, and the three fires are symbolic of the Mississauga's traditional and political alliance with the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, and that Three Fires Council still exists and still holds gatherings. While we have these two communities, the Mississaugas of the New Credit and the Six Nations of the Grand River, really living right next to each other, being neighbors, they're from these two different families, language families and cultural families, the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. So it's interesting that they are such close neighbors. Okay. So this is not a ministry map. This is a map from the Mississaugas themselves. The green part there is what they've identified as their traditional territory, and the blue arrow shows the movement into Southern Ontario. So again, this is a great big long history that I'm going to try and very briefly summarize for you. The Mississaugas split into several groups. One group traveled east to the Bay of Quinte, and then another group traveled south to the Holland and Humber Rivers. And this is where we have the use of the Toronto Herring Place Trail. That group then further split into two groups, and one group moved east towards the Trent River and along Lake Ontario. One group that is connected to the Mississaugas of the New Credit, they moved west towards Toronto and then down towards Lake Erie. So that whole green area, that's the traditional territory of the Mississaugas Credit and now the New Credit First Nation. And where does credit come from, this name? So the French at this time built fur trade posts, and credit was extended to the Mississaugas in terms of the fur. As a result, the river became known as the Credit River, and Europeans identified the Mississaugas as the Mississaugas of the Credit because of good, responsible traders in this trade that they were engaged in. Over time, the settlement of the British and Euro-Canadians becomes more intense, and numerous land surrenders take place. Go from really being responsible and holding much of this land to hold very small amount of land. It becomes increasingly difficult for the Mississaugas to survive with sort of the push of Euro-Canadian settlement. In the 1840s, they accept this offer of land from the Six Nations to establish a settlement. Again, it had originally been their territory that they had sold to the British, and the British gave it to the nation. So it's sort of land going back and forth. Now, Reverend Peter Jones is probably the most well-known or famous person from the Mississaugas of the New Credit. So there are a couple of pictures of him along with his wife, Eliza Field. And I think people from New Credit today would say that he was instrumental in the survival of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. He became a Methodist missionary. He worked as a translator, also a chief for the community. He was sort of mixed background. His father was Welsh and his mother was Anishinaabe. I think he also learned Mohawk as well. He's a very well-known political leader. He wrote to the Indian Department, and that was the first letter of complaint that the Department of Indian Affairs had ever received from an Indigenous person. But he really worked hard for his community. So I'll show you is a drawing of the Credit Mission that was established on the Credit River, and this is now where the Mississauga Golf and Country Club is. So this was a relatively successful mission for a few decades, and then because of land surrenders and the encroachment of sort of the white population into their hunting territories, the move to Six Nations and to become the Mississaugas of the New Credit. Okay, it's important to connect the history from the past to the present. I live in Toronto, but I don't want to make Toronto the center of the world. But so many people do live in Toronto and come through Toronto, and it's important to know how the Mississaugas of the New Credit are connected to in the country. So the Toronto Purchase was one of the early surrenders that the Mississaugas made to the British government. And it was sort of a mess, and I can say that because there was a settled land claim, so I think I'm allowed to say that now. The land was not properly surveyed, the community was not paid properly, and it was disputed. Actually done in 1787. In 1805, the colonial government, they had recognized that some of these things had not been done properly. They didn't have maps describing the lands, which was a requirement. So they tried to solve the problem. They drew a better map. And they paid the community 10 shillings, which obviously was not the value of the land. The Mississaugas of the New Credit, I give them credit for all of the work over many decades that they put into righting this historical wrong. They filed a land claim with Canada, so not Ontario, who I work for, in 1986, and took aids to negotiate. In 2010, it was settled with Canada. And so New Credit received, a bit of what land. I think they figured out what the land was worth at the time, extrapolated to $2010, and so I think that's it says that clearly governments at the time, didn't respect and didn't treat people properly or honorably in the past. And so Toronto is the Mississaugas of the New Credit are the first host First Nation for Toronto and for much of Southern Ontario. Okay, slide here is I asked, we have a GIS works in our ministry. I asked her to create a map of all the communities in Southern Ontario. website that's listed at the end where you can order. We have maps. One is a treaty map and one is a map of First Nations communities, but this is particularly the communities in southern Ontario that might be around where you live and work. I think it's good to know who are the First Nations near you. Okay, back over to Daniel to talk about treaties.
Okay, so treaties. Important part of our presentation, and I actually want to start by letting everyone know that there now is an official Treaties Recognition Week in Ontario. So on May 30th of 2016, and this was sort of Ontario's response to the TRC, Ontario proclaimed the first week of November to be Treaties Recognition Week. And Ontario passed new legislation to recognize the importance of treaties and to bring awareness to the treaty relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in the province. And so the first one happened this past November in 2016 with a library of speakers visiting schools across the province. And they're kind of part of this new emphasis on teaching Canadians about the treaties in Canada, as manifested in other forms too. There's actually a Heritage Minute. I don't know if you've seen it, but a new Heritage Minute all about Treaty 9. And so this is part of this new initiative to teach Canadians about the history of treaties on this land. So I'm going to some of the basics and the way that historians have looked at these treaties and the way that really are remembered quite differently depending on the community. Indigenous peoples and Europeans understood treaties from very different cultural perspectives. So on the left here is an example of how Europeans recorded and documented treaties as written documents. And on the right is a wampum belt, which is one of the ways that Indigenous peoples recorded treaties and other important agreements. And a lot of information can be contained on these wampum belts. They're a visual guide to what the treaty said, but there's a lot of information contained on wampum belts. So I'm going to have some definitions first of what a treaty is. According to the Canadian Oxford Dictionary, a treaty is a formally concluded and ratified agreement between states, as well as an agreement between individuals or parties, especially for the purchase of property. And common understandings of what treaties meant. So there are European treaties, alliances, and Indigenous land surrenders. And making in Canada, it's important to note, it predates the surrender of land and resources. So some of the initial treaties were really kind of alliances, either for the purpose of aid or alliances for the purpose of military strategic alliances. And the treaties can include kind of one-time transactions, like kind of payments, or really establish reciprocal relationships that persist well into the future. Is negotiating and confirming treaties, and this is a very quick summary of what is a lot of really complicated and fascinating history. Gifting and feasts were one of the ways in which positive relationships were formed in the past, either between Indigenous groups or between Indigenous groups and Europeans. Really, Indigenous peoples had different negotiating and confirming treaties, and Europeans took part in these Indigenous protocols. So gift giving and feasting was one of them. So was smoking the calumet pipe, and there you see a picture of a calumet pipe. This kind of a common protocol used in meetings with outsiders, and a really important way of kind of establishing and renewing treaties and showing goodwill between treaty partners. And there's other ways, and of course we're just covering some of the basic ones here, but wampum comes up as one of the ways that Indigenous peoples recorded their understanding of agreements and kind of documented treaties themselves in this physical form. So wampum belts are technically made from shells of Atlantic marine animals. These tend to be in white and purple colors. I'm sure a lot of you have seen wampum belts. The really important pieces of treaty history in what is now Ontario. And these practices were used in all phases of the treaty making, but they become less common in the territorial treaties as we approach the modern era. Really, there's a summary of a whole lot of history, kind of basic phases of treaty making in what's now Ontario and Canada. At first, there were commercial compacts, and this is what traders had to do when they were trading with Indigenous communities, was establish a relationship with them, and really kind of establish an alliance, because trade would only occur with most Indigenous groups with their allies. And so alliances had to be made even for these fur traders who were, ostensibly pursuing commercial ends. They often engaged in certain types of treaty making. And during these commercial compacts in this early phase of Canadian colonial history, Europeans are very dependent on Indigenous peoples for food as well as for furs and kind of the necessities of survival in this escape. And in this initial phase of treaty making, wampum and ceremonies could be used to establish the relationship and renew it. In phase we have listed here are kind of peace, friendship, and alliance treaties. And I think the key there is alliance, because a lot of military alliances made with Indigenous groups in the colonial period. And this is a profound shaping of the nature of the relationship with Indigenous peoples in what is now Ontario, these military alliances. So during the colonial period, the French in the early 17th century initially allied with the Huron-Wendat, whereas the British allied with the Haudenosaunee, and these were long-lived colonial alliances that had a really profound impact on the history of colonial warfare and Indigenous history in this land. So this is the second phase that we've identified here. And the final phase, the territorial treaties, these are what really lead us into modern day treaties and how we speak about them. And see a shift towards territorial treaties in mid-18th century, really after the 7 Years' War and the Royal Proclamation. Slide about the Royal Proclamation. This is issued in 1763. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. It's from King George III, and his attempt to manage the British territories that were gained during the 7 Years' War. And it made some provisions relating to Indigenous peoples. Probably most importantly, it bade the settlement in what they call Indian country, with a large territory to the west of the Appalachian Mountains. And it established that ownership over Indigenous territory could only be transferred by agreement between the Crown and Indigenous peoples at public meetings. So it establishes for the British this treaty-making protocol, the territorial treaty-making protocol that we would see take place in the next 200 years. As that had not been purchased by the Crown, reserved for Indigenous peoples at their hunting grounds. A really important moment, 1963, and the proclamation is still invoked today. And an important piece of the underlying justification for treaties and for the way they are again, really remembered in Ontario. So I'm going to go through pre-Confederation treaties and then post-Confederation treaties before handing it over to Alison for the final segment on the claims process. So there were a number of treaties in Ontario before Ontario was part of Canada. And this is an important point to recognize because in some ways the treaty history in Ontario is more complicated than what you find in the western provinces of Canada. We have numbered treaties that are established after Confederation. Well, Ontario has our pre-Confederation treaties and then post-Confederation treaties. So the pre-Confederation treaties really dated the movement of settlers and resource extraction, and generally they were for one-time payments of money and goods in exchange for the rights to land. Annuities and reserves are included in these treaties. And there wasn't a continued use of Indigenous protocol when these were negotiated. It's just an example of perhaps the most important pre-Confederation treaty. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but it's something that has been just recently commemorated after its 250th anniversary. And this wampum belt, you can see at the very bottom, is called the Covenant Chain Wampum Belt. And it was presented at the conclusion of this Council of Niagara and still referred to often. And you can actually see the date, 1764, written on it, as well as the two human figures holding hands. It's all very, symbolic language of alliance, and it signifies some of the kind of underlying ethic of the treaty itself. There are Confederation treaties, including our own numbered treaties here in Ontario, 3, 5, and 9. These generally were for Ojibwe Cree communities in northern Ontario. They generally included annuities and one-time payments, and they generally entailed a continuing rights for hunting, fishing, and trapping on Crown land. And kind of the last major treaty is the Williams treaties of 1923, and this treaty kind of covered areas already subject to other treaties but had not been properly sorted out, and they include the Chippewas of Lake Simcoe and Huron, the Mississaugas of Rice Lake, Scugog, Curve Lake, and Alderville. And that's a really brief kind of history of treaties. Today in Ontario, it's covered by 46 treaties and land purchases. And most recently, the Algonquin land claim represents unceded Aboriginal title kind of along the Ottawa River on the eastern end of the province. This land claim is actually currently negotiated. So I'll pass it over to Alison now, and she's going to take you through a bit of information on the land claims process.
Okay, and actually we've spent so much time, and I want to make sure there's time for questions, so I'm going to be very brief in talking about the land claims process. I'll just say one thing. This is one of the maps that's available. It's obviously very hard to see on your screen, but if you go to ontario.ca/treaties, there's a whole bunch of information, and you can order this map, the treaties map. You can download it as a PDF, and you can also order the First Nations communities map, which is the other big map that we've shown. I'm going to skip a bunch of these slides because I think the purpose of what you wanted to know about for this was an overview of Indigenous communities today, and also especially the Six Nations and New Credit. So this sort of, based on what I'm going to skip. Email me. And actually quite a bit of this, again, is available on our website, the kinds of claims that we negotiate. Bit of this site. So I've been in the government for up to 2 years, but when you're outside of government, I was not aware of all of the work that was being done with the ministry to settle land claims. And you can see obviously that chart on the right it shows a huge increase. Ministry was founded in 2008 the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs, and that was after the Ipperwash inquiry. I'm sure many of you remember the stance and the death of Dudley George, and then the inquiry afterwards. And the findings was that land claims were not being dealt with quickly enough. And land claims obviously are occurring for various reasons, but basically that Daniel just talked about, the honor of the Crown was not being upheld, and that basically there was a problem. So this is work that we are continuing to do in the ministry. Lawmakers being transferred back to communities, and also settlement monies. And those stats there are just for Ontario. Communities often file land claims with either Ontario or Canada, or often both. So those numbers will also be much higher. So in terms of land claims, when they come into the province, both Daniel and I work as researchers. Research gets submitted to the province, and then we sort of assess the research that comes in, and then we do our research. That again talks about a lot of the process, and again, there's something called the Guide to Submitting Land Claim on Ontario's website, and all of this information is available there if you're interested. Some of the research that we do, the kinds of documents that we use as historians, I thought that you might be interested in, but I want to make sure we leave time. Okay, that is that website at the top is our website that has a lot of information about treaties, a very good overview, I think, as well as lists to other sources. And then I've also given you the websites there for the Six Nations of Grand River, Ontario, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. And both of those sites also have lots of information clearly from their own perspective, not from our perspective. I wanted to give you a bit of information if you're interested in more about the history of Indigenous Ontario, and then also a couple books that relate to museums, I think that you will already, and if not, you might be interested in. That first book there by Don Smith and Ed Rogers, Aboriginal Ontario, Thunder and Press, you can buy it as an ebook or you can order it from their website. It's a big fat book that has chapters devoted to different parts of the province and different time periods, and I think it is really like a reference Bible. I think it's a very, very good, useful, well-written book. It's written by different authors, and I think it's a great book. Julie Morgan's book on creating colonial past, that's a new book in terms of commemoration. I thought it might interest some of you. And I think, I'm not sure if Keith Jamieson and Michelle Hamilton are speaking or are involved in your I feel like they might be, or the event later this week. There's a new book on, as we call him, Dr. O. There's one of the first medical doctors, Indigenous man from Six Nations. So it's a lot of history of the Six Nations. And Hamilton's book, which I think many of you might know because it does deal with museums. And then for more information on the Mississauga, the New Credit, Don Smith, who's a retired historian in Calgary, has really written he's really the best known historian on the Mississauga, and those books are U of T Press. And there, when we were a couple weeks ago visiting the Mohawk Chapel, so there's our email addresses. We are happy to answer questions or give you any other information if you want to email us for information. We're happy to take your questions. So I'll leave that slide up, and then maybe as questions are coming in, we'll go back and I'll leave up the book slide if you want to write any of those down. So thanks very much for your time, and we're happy to answer any questions if we can, and if we can't, we'll email you back our answers.
Thank you very much, Alison and Daniel, for that presentation. We do have a little time left for questions. There's a chat function, and you just send to the presenters. That'll get to us. So you can get typing any questions that you may have, and we'll try and answer everything in the time that we have. We have one question so far. So you had a slide indicating the number of land claims that had been settled. Excuse me. And we have a question as to how many claims have been denied since 1983.
Sorry, I just wanted to make sure I was unmuted. That's a good question. I actually don't know the answer. I do know that since I've arrived in the ministry, it is very rare to deny a land claim. there's something like 90 to 95% of claims that are submitted, I'd say, in the last 5 to 10 years, probably. Those claims are accepted for negotiation. I think historically, and this is sort of my, I don't want to say non-expert, but my sort of sense for the last couple of years, and having a bit of an awareness of the history of land claims previously. I think previously, it was hard to get a land claim submitted. That's the sense, especially with Canada. But Ontario established the ministry and started accepting land claims as well. I think both Ontario and Canada are accepting more. I don't know the stat for Canada, but I do know that for Ontario, vast majority of claims are accepted for negotiation. And why that's the case, I think the province, certainly under this premier, has a different attitude towards Indigenous issues in the province. She was formerly of our ministry. I think things are changing, and people's willingness to recognize that things were not done well in the past. Inside is that there's a willingness to address all of these issues. So the vast majority of claims are accepted. Claims that come in that are not accepted, it's rare, and my sense is that the government does not want to not accept land claims. That's my sense. It's hard to deny a land claim or to not accept it for negotiation. But I don't have a number.
And we have another question, just for either of you. What are your thoughts on the Haldeman Tract?
Exactly you mean by that question. If you mean presently, what's going on in the tract with the land claims, politics over the tract. A very messy and complicated history. It's not the ministry that is involved in the land claim process, or because it's in litigation and we are in the negotiations division, so I don't actually know much in terms of what's going on. Of land and a very long history and a lot of complicated. I think some of the land sales might have been okay, and many of them weren't okay, and all things weren't done properly. That would be my general thought, but I can't really. But partly because I'm not involved, and I shouldn't say what Ontario's view on that is. I think it's. When I think about Southern Ontario and I think about the traditional territory of the Mississaugas, that large green area on the map, I think about the Haldeman Tract, these large pieces of really valuable, good earth, agriculturally, land that is really great land, and the Indigenous people who were on that land were really outnumbered and only became increasingly outnumbered, and had to deal with the pressures of immigration and colonial governments. Those need to be dealt with forward, and I'm not involved in making any of those decisions. But I think things have gotten better, but I think it needs to continue to happen.
Any other questions before we wrap up? We have another one. Is the land claim process different if between two different Indigenous groups? So, for example, island area where an Indigenous group made treaties, but it's being disputed by another Indigenous group claiming that the had no rights as they were guests on their traditional land.
Again, that's complicated. I think my sense that is in Ontario, we don't have as many conflicts between First Nations over territory, what was traditional territory when the British arrived and made surrenders. in Southern Ontario, and we have Wendat in parts around Toronto, who are put out. We have Haudenosaunee people who then are on the land. We have Seneca villages, who then also are either pushed out or leave or on their own, depending on who you're talking to. And then we have the Mississauga in the same land. I mean, we have generations of Indigenous people using the same pieces of land over centuries. So and those communities would all say, that was a traditional territory for a certain part of time. That's complicated because Europeans arrive. And some people hold particular pieces of land when Europeans arrive and start negotiating. My sense is that we don't see a lot of conflicts or disagreements between First Nations over pieces of land. Actually, I don't even really know of like the exhibit you're talking about. I actually don't really know, but I'm happy for you to email me if you'd like more information. I can try to find you more information about a particular case. But a land claim, it's accompanied by a whole lot of research, and primary source documents are all submitted. Usually very, very good research, very thorough research explaining what happened in the past. Ontario conducts our own research, and if Canada's involved, they also conduct their own research. So I feel by the end of that process, we really know what happened. So we get of sort of the history. But yeah, it's pretty complicated. Sorry, I just saw the chat come in, right? Here on Church between Walpole Island and the Wyandotte. Yeah, I mean, I don't know anything about that situation. Yeah, and so I don't know, like in terms of a land claim, like I think if a claim was submitted from two communities for the same land, like I think they'd both be assessed and potentially they'd be settled with both groups. I mean, I've not heard of that happening since I've been here, but yeah, I don't know. It's messy. Like all this history is really messy, I think, and complicated, and not necessarily straightforward or simple. But a lot of people who work on these things and who are trying to find out what happened and resolve historical grievances. I mean, that's really what the focus. We work in this division called the Negotiations and Reconciliation Division. So trying to figure out what happened and resolving past wrongs is really the work that we do. Yeah, so if I find out more for you, but I don't know off the top of my head.
Well, thank you, everybody. That takes us to the end of our time. As Anna and Daniel mentioned, if you have additional questions, their email addresses are there on the screen. I did have one question about the slides. The slides themselves will not be made available, but this recording will be sent out, so you can have access to that and review what happened today. So, next slide. So I would like to thank Alison and Daniel for sharing with us today, and again thank our project partners and supporters, particularly the Government of Canada and the Government of Ontario for their support of this webinar. I want to thank you all for participating today. When you webinar, there will be a directed to a short evaluation form. If you could take a few minutes just to give us some feedback, we find that very valuable. And we look forward to seeing you all on Thursday, either in person or joining us through the online streaming. Information about how to log into the online streaming will be emailed this week, so keep your eyes open for that. But otherwise, that's about it for us today. So have a great day, and we'll see you soon.